a real pleasure to be in conversation with Julian Hector, who, as you know, is chair of the steering group for Communicate, and this is his fourth Communicate. He's also chair for the whole of the Bristol Natural History Consortium, so putting together the whole plethora of BioBlitz, Communicate and the Bristol Festival of Nature. He's a BBC executive, as I'm sure you know, and has done things like he did a panorama special on illegal trade of ivory, which was an investigative journalist kind of thing, as well as radio producing Saving Species, Shared Planet, and TV series of things like Animal Sex, Wild... Battle of the Sexes, and also a series on wild Africa. He's in charge of the natural history films that end up on the One Show. So I'll also tell you a bit about David Shukman, but maybe before, but we'll do that together. Maybe before doing that, why... Julian was really excited about David Shukman coming. You know, David Shukman, science editor for the BBC. Why were you so excited that we were going to have him?
David is the BBC's. I don't want to be too kind of BBC-centric, but the BBC is an enormous organisation, and its news operation is, the institution in many respects, and it's a global outfit, and the BBC, of course, is a really important sort of cultural player in the world, and that's why I'm stressing the importance of this. But David Shukman became the first science editor in the BBC, and you probably know other editors. I mean, Stephanie Flanders is running around all over the place as economics editor. You know, Robert Peston as the business editor, and Jeremy Bowen as the Middle East editor. Whenever there are sort of big areas of newsworthiness where things are changing and unfolding, where the importance goes right up, we assign editors in the news world. They're very senior. They gather information, and David Shukman became the first science editor the BBC's ever had, post Professor Steve Jones's report on the way in which the BBC, as a huge organisation, is representing science. And his conclusions were that we need to do more to bring science, and in which I include environment too, to the fore. And one of those recommendations was that a science editor was appointed, and that's David. And if you watch the news, if you listen to the news, if you watch the news, you'll see David popping up every now and then. And that's why I'm excited, because I think news and environment is going up the agenda. Not enough, but it's going up.
It's going up. And how long has the BBC had an arts editor for?
Well, I think the arts editor is almost as old as the BBC, isn't it? Will Gauntlets. And you all know him, don't you? He comes on. But there have been various guises in the arts world. So I would say that the BBC has been absolutely fantastic in representing arts, and maybe sort of media organisations in general that disseminate news and stories and features are stronger on the arts. And I think sort of science and the environment, everyone's accepting, has been held back. Why? Because, I mean, the last 2 days that we've been talking, we've been stressing the importance, as we have in the last 10 years, of Communicate. And I think there is some catch-up happening.
And just a little bit about the kind of pedigree as a journalist of David. You know, he was a war reporter, defence correspondent for decades, Northern Ireland in some of the most tricky times as well. He was there at the Berlin Wall coming down. Say a little bit about why he's such a good person to be representing science.
Well, I think, David, the thing about news is that news is really populated by journalists. And all of you, I mean, some of you are journalists, actually, but all of you, who want to get your stories into mainstream media, the best way to do that is to contact journalists, whether it's through professional parts of your organisations or you personally. And journalists, I've got to be a bit careful with sort of animal analogies, but journalists aren't grazers, if you know what I mean. They're more predators. And journalists are interested in observation and recording. They're interested in sort of measurement. And they sit and wait, and they look for things. And journalists, really do want the scoop. And they don't want a bad story. The analogy of a predator: if a predator gets injured, it's no longer a predator; it can't eat anymore. A journalist doesn't want a bad story. A journalist wants a good story. And David has got a fantastic track record at being hungry for stories, trying to find the truth, trying to find a new interpretation. And David, who I've got to know a little bit recently, is really genuinely hungry about some of these issues that are facing the world, and particularly facing the relationship between the natural world, science, and people.
You would have thought after decades of being in war zones, he would want to settle down a bit rather than cranking up to be science and environment editor.
Yeah, but he likes standing on ice floes and things.
So he still has the adrenaline going. Now, what about how hard is it to get science stories, say, into the 10 o'clock news? I mean, great, science up the agenda, yes, science editor, a bit more clout. Does it really matter? How hard is it to get those stories in, and how much does that matter?
I think it is quite hard to get science stories into the 10 o'clock news, but I mean, David would have presented that, and I can't speak for David. This won't take too long, but you might need to know a little bit about, the anatomy of news programmes and how they're structured. Now, I can't go through all of them, but the BBC's got an enormous number of news outlets. It's got international news outlets. It's got national news outlets. It's got news on radio, news on television, news online. Okay, all that can be sort of broken down. But if you take radio for a kick-off, take Radio 4, 5 Live is about rolling news and conversation and sport, of course, but just take Radio 4 for now. That Radio 4 starts with a news briefing at 5:30 and the Today programme at 6. The whole point of that at 6 in the morning is to set the news agenda of the day. That's how the Today programme works. And an awful lot of what makes the Today programme, in a way, has been set by the daily newspapers. They want to add new stuff to it, but the daily newspapers are really important because they're the first, in a way. And then you go through where you have the World at 1, which is some assessment of how accurate that news agenda was, PM, which is kind of analysis as well as conversation. Then 6 o'clock is the kind of news summary. If you've been on the moon for the day, didn't know what on earth was going on, the 6 o'clock news is the one thing that you can go for, and then the 10 o'clock news is an analysis of the day. Television is the other way around. The 10 o'clock news on television, I would say, and I think David would have said this, is the kind of premier programme to get a big story on. The 10 o'clock news is the one where the story has to be biggest and best, most poignant, most relevant to the conversation going on nationally or internationally. And the kind of newsroom to get things on the 10 o'clock news, it's an expression that you quite liked. It's like a sort of bear pit. It's competitive. And although all the news outlets know the kind of news and the assemblies of news and the running orders, but lots and lots of stories are prepared for the 10 o'clock news, and a lot of them aren't going to make it.
So I love this expression, bear pit. When you see the 10 o'clock or any news, it seems so calm. It's so terribly British, isn't it, to be calm? And the idea of people like David Shukman and other editors, they're trying to get their stories in, it's not one that you assume. So presumably part of his role is getting not only his stories, but any stories from science and environment.
It is, and it's good news for you as delegates of conference. It is David Shukman's role to try and bring science and environment higher up. And all journalists want a story. And they want a story which has a kind of story arc. And if you were to give them a lead on a story, and a lot of you have come up to me over the last 2 days and given me leads of stories, and that's what journos want, a lead. But they're thinking, what is the kind of beginning, middle, and end of the story? And a classic arc of a story is problem, impacts, solution. And it might be that not in equal order, depending what the story is, but it's problem, impact, solution. And what they're trying to do is when you give them a lead, they're trying to see what lead you're giving them to feed that bit of the story arc. And if a story has got a really nice shape and it's poignant and it's good journalism and it's original, then it has a much, much higher chance of getting to that kind of premier news show. But there are other news programmes.
And one of the things we would have spent time with David trying to unpick is how does he get stories into those kind of slots through the bear pit? How does he get those kinds of stories? Now, he has sent us a couple of snippets of his films. So let's watch the first one of those and then think about why that made it in. So, Tim, if we could show the first.
Condemned to death by plastic, the hook in the beak of this albatross chick means it can't feed and faces starvation. Wildlife expert John Claviter tries to help. Plastic is emerging as a real danger.
You want me just to...
And hold the wings like that?
Yeah.
I'm going to simply... And this is squid juice, this is normal.
The mother stays close by.
Any idea yet what it might be?
Not yet. We just want to make sure there's nothing sharp.
There could be a hook on the end or something.
Yeah, and it looks like we're going to be able to get it out. There we go. And now we can release the chick. Okay.
It's a small net that once held fruit in a distant supermarket. Piece by piece, this kind of plastic creeps relentlessly towards Midway on the tide. Being remote is no defence. And right now, the chicks are hungry. There are nearly 2 million albatrosses here, and they're all at risk.
The problem for an albatross chick like this is that its staple food is squid, when all too often its parents mistakenly feed it plastic, like these cigarette lighters. They look incredibly similar, but these can prove fatal. Now, what researchers here are finding is that every single albatross on Midway contains some quantity of plastic. You couldn't get a clearer example of how our plastic waste has become such a threat to the natural world.
Fighting the plastic requires a constant effort, an attempt to clean up. We filmed one operation for just 30 minutes. Here it is speeded up. Look how much rubbish was found on this one stretch of shoreline.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. When I last saw David, he was giving a talk, and he would have done this. Maybe I shouldn't be preempting him, but he's shown, in case he comes next year. He says he brings out a little bit of green plastic that he says he carries with him all the time that had been fished out of one of those little albatross beaks. He said it just made such a massive impression on him, and he brings it out to show people and share that story. But Julian, from your perspective, why did that get into the news? How did that make it through the bear pit?
Well, it had a really lovely problem impacts solution arc for a news programme. It wasn't a news feature, remember? And the lead was that news was given this evidence that a lot of plastic was being ingested by seabirds. And these are spectacular seabirds that could be filmed, and you could get close to them. There could be that, in the jargon, that vital two-shot, where you have presenter and bird there, and actual evidence of the problem, which was the plastic coming out there. So there's a kind of filmic opportunity. Funnily enough, the lead wouldn't have been that the whole of the Pacific, as we know, is one great vortex of plastic. I mean, the microfilament plastic story is another one that has made the news as well at the same time. But actually, it was the fact that you could go and film the evidence. Something I was going to say, which is what's important with that film as well, is that the motto of all journalists, I hope, is not "don't let the truth get in the way of a good story," but the motto of all journalists is "go to source." And so if someone gives a good lead about a story like that, and then it can be researched through, and they find that the source actually can deliver, as it were, from the tip-off or from the lead or from whatever, then it stands a very good chance. So that news has to go to source. It can't be second-hand. And that's a real recommendation I can give to all of you, is that you might have stories, but the most important stories are the ones that you originate yourself, or that you are very close to the source of it that you can direct someone to. It's that sort of thing that makes it to news programmes, which then become part, hopefully, of the sort of national conversation.
Speaking with Julian before this event, he said part of what he was excited about with David's new position, because it's only been since January this year, is that there's the potential to start national conversations. And I think that's a way it's useful to think about him, as well as getting stories into the news. When we want national conversations, he's a person who can help to make them happen. OK, Tim, maybe we could see the next bit of film. We just began last time.
From the distance, it doesn't seem real. A strange tower, 40 stories high, bathed in light. But this weird new landmark in a field outside Seville is actually a new kind of solar power station. And these beams lighting up the sky could help head off the worst effects of global warming. When you're close up, these look just like steel panels. But in fact, I'm standing in a field of giant mirrors, all focusing the sun's rays in one direction. The beams are aimed at the top of the tower. It's painful to look at, but it's here that the sunlight is transformed into thermal energy. And all of this sunlight is reflected up here to the top of this tower. It's incredibly bright and hot. The temperature here can reach more than 400 degrees centigrade, enough to power a boiler here, which in turn goes on to generate huge amounts of electricity.
Here is revelation and scale, and it's worth and science particularly can really generate revelation and scale, and it was so visual. But there's an important distinction here between the different platforms in the jargon of broadcasting. So we touched in our introduction that there's online and online news from lots of suppliers is very popular. Then you have television news, which you see an example of here. And then you have radio news. And television news, unless it's something which everyone just absolutely needs to know about right now because it might be really important in the next hour or two, television news does require some good visuals. And what you see here is a story which has got some strong visuals. And, of course, visuals can take any form. And another interesting story, which was just a piece of science, was when scientists revealed that dinosaurs had feathers. There's evidence that they might have coloured feathers. And that kind of led, it was quirky, it didn't have the classic sort of problem, impact, solution sort of structure. It was just revelation and the kind of going to source, going where the actual story has originated from. And radio is important for all of you, like print journalism. Radio is important because radio, slightly different to television, is more of an ideas-led medium. It's easier on radio to have a sort of narrative that links sort of intellectual thoughts in a dialogue, in a narrative. And television tends to have to be in your face like that. And that's why it's good for you to know, because you have contacts, I'm sure, with print, television, and radio journalists. And if you don't take the predatory analogy too far, but they they predate in a slightly different way. And over the last couple of days, I've spoken to a number of you, and you either come from or have press offices and all that. But the thing about press offices and things, and they're no different to you if you don't work in one, is that they have contacts. Contacts with the press. And I come back to this unit of news, and which is sort of journalism, really. And what you want to do is have contacts with journalists. You want to kind of get to know journalists. You want journalists to get to know you. Remember, they probably feel under more pressure than you do to find stories. I think you have to assume that there's some really hungry men and women out there who want a good story, who want to contribute to these narratives running in society the whole time and contribute to them. I mean, most recently, the government U-turn in the badger cull, but the badger story has been running a long time, and there have been journalists running around all over the place trying to find different lines in, different nuances, different arguments, upsets, little fires burning, with the whole badger debate. That's a big story with strong legs that's been running. But that's my advice, is is to get to know journalists, get journalists to get to know you, be attractive to them, and remember a journalist.
How can you be attractive to a journalist?
Just be a story generator, be an ideas generator. Give the impression that you have leads, be close to sources, love your activity, love your stories. Feed them with the ideas. I think that's being attractive to a journalist.
Thank
but
you.
remember, they're never off. They're never off duty. So you can't. I don't think you can talk to a journo and say, and now my conversation's over, then start gossiping like hell about something else, because that's probably what they'll write about. So, do you see? So it's a kind of tetchy relationship, really. But people like David, I know in some ways, and other editors and other journalists which you hear about reporting on television news, online, I mean, they're all approachable. You can find their email addresses really quite easily. On most of the websites, you can talk directly to the newsrooms, to the individuals, and you can get leads out to journalists quite easily. And as I say, don't forget about the print journalism as well. An awful lot of mainstream broadcast news has been originated, has been stimulated by print journalism, because print journalism is going on the whole time, and they get their papers out first thing in the morning if it's the national dailies, and that informs other news. So anything goes, I'd say.
And it seems amazing in these times that print journalism still can set the whole day's agenda.
And their online versions.
And their online versions, when we think of it as being something that's dwindling away in some ways. Now, I've got a few more things I think it's worth us still exploring, and that Julian is able to help to convey. But just pausing there for a minute, anything from you so far, anything on, here's ways that I've found it really useful to get into the news, or just observations on David's role and what he does?
Hello. I ran a photo agency for a long time, and we sold environmental stories, and we found that we could get a wider, deeper coverage if we had a set of pictures. So the story could be, exactly like Julian said, could be a fantastic story, but if you want to get international coverage, or you want to get onto page 3 of the daily papers, then if you have one lead picture that is international quality, world-class picture, but then ideally you have 15 to 25 pictures to go with it, that set will then mean you get half a page, but also journalists around the world can take their own angle on it. So then you end up with sometimes 60, 70 countries with one story if you've got a good set.
Wow, so not just one great image, a whole 15 of them.
But one of the 15 will have to be world-class.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. That's really helpful.
A lot of organisations have got their own HD filming facilities, etc. If we've got great visuals that would form part of a package for you, how do you work that? Do you have to badge it, or do you have to come out and refilm it yourself?
No, don't have to refilm it, but it's done very much story for story. Of course, it's a rights issue, and it depends how important the archive is, and so you've shot it. If it's unique footage and of an event, I mean, if it's I don't know, if it's extraordinary footage of a whale stranding and actually getting the whale back in the water again and seeing it swim off, or something like that, or the whale in the Thames keeping on whales. Other people's footage was used for that because it was unique and actually part of the story, and there would have been personal conversations about rights and all that sort of thing about who owns that. But yes, it's not. It's really important in any news operations editorial guidelines that they can actually authenticate that what is being said and when it was filmed and where it was is absolutely clear and can be verified. And that it's off our radar a bit at this conference. But if you think about some of the events going on in the Arab world at the moment, some things are making the news of uprisings and going on in Syria, for example. They haven't been shot by the BBC, but the BBC might have tried, or the Sky or whatever might have tried to verify that this actually happened here or there, and couldn't, and they kind of put a warning. So in terms of addressing your question directly, if it can be used. If it can't be verified exactly, if it can't be proved exactly that it was filmed where it was and where it was suggested, there has to be a big health warning put out.
Okay. We've been talking a lot today about behavioural responses to problems, science problems, and things like that. Now, engagement doesn't look very good. It doesn't have very many great images. And I was just wondering, do we go to the same place if we've got a really fantastic local story? Now, that would be local, but about people power, about people doing things, people responding to things. Where do you go for that? Because we don't have the images, and it is a bit of a problem.
Yes, yeah. Well, I forgot to. It's nice that you've mentioned that, because, of course, there are regional and local news outlets, both in print, online, and TV form, radio form. So, and a local story, which might have a local sort of hero attached to it, a driving character, could be of great value locally and great interest locally. And your presentation, today might have well had a sort of hero attached to it, and that's got real value, I would say, in making it a news program. But but extending it beyond that, no pictures. If there are no pictures, it's a bit awkward for television. I mean, it is. But as I said, radio has got a more sort of ideas-led approach, because it's all about conversation and speech, and so maybe it suits radio. And you talk about stills. If there are iconic pictures attached to it, sometimes the print journalism could lend itself. But just to finish, on local, because heroes and local against adversity, really rich fodder, and with that lovely kind of resolution, that they solve the problems, or things are getting better, they're fighting the adversity. And in situations like that, depending on the story, sometimes local story can be of national and even international interest. So it could be happening in a very small locality, but is seen as kind of principled for the rest of the country, and that can make a major news program. But pictures you need for television.
Okay, now let's try be quite brief. I think some of the answers to this are really clear. So there was this Professor Steve Jones report on the BBC's science output, and he made various recommendations, one of which was having an editor-level person. What other changes have been made in the BBC in response to that report?
It sounds a bit bureaucratic, but
just briefly.
Yeah, the key thing is a sort of science forum has been set up, which has got a lot of the bigwigs of the BBC sitting around it. And it sounds a bit unusual, but it's the first time that it's happened, really. So this science forum has got people like David on it. It's got commissioning editors from television and radio and online. It's got the big beasts of the news world, like the editor of Panorama and things. And it also has the heads of science radio. So everyone is together, and they meet and they make an assessment. And it was originally chaired by George Entwistle, but he's gone up one. And it's now chaired by someone who's fulfilling his old role. And so it's a high-level meeting in the Beeb, and that's how science across the piece is kept an eye on.
OK, so just like in many places, the BBC has its own different areas, TV, radio, science, factual, news, different areas, and that's partly about getting everybody talking to each other. Good. Anything that was in the report that hasn't changed?
Well, I don't know whether I can answer that empirically, but one of Steve Jones's great criticisms was that there was a lot of onus in output on opinion as opposed to fact, and that was a kind of hard area for us. I mean, obviously, go to the sources where the facts. We've talked a lot about facts in the last couple of days, but opinion can be important, and this was particularly relevant, I think, with climate change. I think the big criticism was that far too much time was spent on climate skepticism as opposed to the kind of science of climate change, and the argument was that the climate change skeptics were basing their arguments on an opinion as opposed to science. And much more airtime was done on science. And I think also just more, which I don't think we're doing just enough maybe or whatever, but just more about the practice. The kind of, science is unfolding and happening on so many fronts, in so many areas, in so many fields, and actually most of the science reporting, certainly in news outlets, tends to go in kind of big areas. I mean, I can tell you, a lot of onus is put on GM and biotechnology. A lot of onus is put on energy. A lot of onus is put on what kind of government call nano. A lot of government, which is kind of materials science, that sort of thing. And you've got the idea, that the kind of news tends to be kind of, and programs tend to be dealing with these very big rivers of scientific activity, rather than all these little things going on around. But some programs and online is doing a lot of the small discoveries, the small work, the kind of, how insects see in different wavelengths to us and how maybe their world looks. Those things that don't make major news programs.
And can you say anything about David's global agenda?
Yeah, well, David, I think, from speaking to David, and David would have to speak for himself really on this, but I sort of touched on this a little bit just now, is that David's sources, I imagine at that level, are much more linked to major, sort of scientific agendas led in part by how science is funded. And a lot of the funding comes, through government and things. And I think I've sort of highlighted them really. I think materials science is very important, and we'll be looking very much at that. Energy is the other big area. Biotechnology, food, that sort of thing is a very big area. And I have to say, very cautiously, when I was talking about it with him, I didn't see biodiversity and bioabundance there in that great big list. And I harks back to a point that Doug made yesterday about, DEFRA as a department, isn't as high as other government departments. And it's in a democracy. It's up to us, the nation, to make sort of DEFRA a bigger department in the kind of governmental hierarchy than it is. There were some other ones, which climate change, of course, is the other major one. But it might well be. I saw Martin come in. If I could say, Martin, it's nice to see you. Martin's recently, if I could say, retired from DEFRA. Was a senior civil servant in DEFRA. Martin, could you say anything more about the kind of, as you left, kind of government science priority in this sort of DEFRA world?
I don't know. There's quite a bit I've spoken about in the past about this, but I think it was unfortunate that a regular survey, which used to be held by DEFRA, which was every 5-year repeat survey about which environmental issues people found to be the most important, up until 2001, from 1986, the biodiversity was moving up each time. It moved up from something like 16th to something like 8th, which was progress. And that survey isn't done anymore. I'd quite like to know what would have happened had that been the case. I think a point in terms of how government overall treats the different issues it deals with, it does depend very much on the personal influence and interest of the Secretary of State, and certainly the Secretary of State in DEFRA has changed since I left, so I can't really comment on that. But I think I've said to you before, Julian, that during the 10 years or so from when DEFRA was set up until I left earlier this year, each of the Secretaries of State in turn had been taking more personal interest in biodiversity, and certainly Hilary Benn and Caroline Spellman, over the last 4 or 5 years, were very personally interested. It meant that I, as an official, saw more of the top-level people, and the top-level people were taking those discussions into Cabinet, and that's how it works. So, I felt that we were on an upward curve in terms of interest and opportunity to influence matters progressively, but it does depend very much on who the Secretary of State is and where they place their greatest priority. Caroline Spellman had actually, in her sort of job title, asked specifically for climate change and biodiversity to be one of the subjects which was mentioned, in her sort of job description, and that was an indication of how important she thought that was. I'm sure that doesn't answer your question for a moment, but I just thought it would offer a couple of reflections.
Going to source. Thank you very much. And I guess, I mean, this conference has been running for 10 years. When we first began, climate change wasn't one of those topics. You know, it wasn't one of the ways into the news. And that's one of the changes that we've seen. And there's been a running conversation about biodiversity and other areas and how to make them included. You'd also said to me before today that David doesn't particularly see natural history as being within his realm.
Well, rolls on from Martin's point, I think. I mean, it depends on a Secretary of State. I'm not putting Szyszman in that sort of guise, but he's wrestling with being editor of science in a huge global sort of news outfit, and I think he's wondering where the natural world fits into that kind of science frame, and because science is an enormous sort of collective human activity, terribly relevant to environment, of course, and natural history. And so much of what we've been talking about over the last couple of days is about evidence-based communication. And I think he would have really liked to have heard this and to have been influenced in that way.
Well, and I think it's something that we can all still do. It's try to find ways to inspire him and others.
Bombard him.
Bombard. See him as a predator. Any of those things that Julian said. Be attractive to news people. But we've heard some of the ways we might be able to do it. And if there is... just choosing a few stories, a few major areas where it's easy to get science in, I think doesn't do justice to the whole breadth of science and the environment. And, we have the chance to try to change that by having those 15 amazing images, including a world-class one, as well as the stories, whether it's local people getting through adversity, or whether it's another kind of story. We'll round up. I'll come back to Julian at the end and ask for his hopes for the next 10 years. But pausing, and also your hopes for how this role, David's role, will mature, because he's been doing it for less than a year. But over to you for any ways to inspire news to cover other things, or last thoughts at the conference.
It may be a cynical ploy, but if you have a story and you're having trouble getting journalists to pick it up, I know this works on a local level, something I learned the hard way. We were trying to get something about at Bristol sustainability work into the local newspapers, and we contacted them and told about the huge energy reduction, and they said they weren't interested. And we said what we were doing with new technology and sustainable technologies and the way that's leading, especially in the region, and the examples we have, and they weren't interested. We spoke about culture change and dialogue, and they weren't interested. And we explained about the building tours with this technology, and we happened to mention that on the building tours we take school groups, and they went, school groups, fantastic. And they came around and they did a whole page feature leading on the school groups. Now, luckily, the journalist allowed us to then take the feature into more of an in-depth area of what we were doing and the bigger issues. But if you have an issue, local media loves kids in pictures. So if you've got an issue and you want to get a school group in to look at it, then the journalist will come down to photograph the children looking at it. It is worth bearing in mind if a bit cynical.
Thank you.
It's a two-shot.
Yes.
Kind of a thought to finish. I don't know. Leading on from that, is it about changing the news agenda?
Is it about changing the news agenda? Certainly, from my perspective, I would hope that one of the things Szyszman does over time, I don't think he's doing it yet, is to actually shape the agenda rather than just get stories in. And we, I think, should be trying to change the news agenda. So the next 10 years, including hopes about David, and if you can incorporate sex, death and animals, that would be good.
I can't incorporate that, but very quickly, because it's sort of end of conference now. But, I hope, I'll challenge David Szyszman to make sure that he grabs this big agenda of science, environment, and the natural world, and really gets on top of where the big modern agenda must be going. And surely it's going in our changing relationship as a human population with the natural world on which we all depend. And I suspect the big question that will be asked is how and in what way are people and the natural world going to negotiate the same space? And I think that is going to spawn just so many controversies, ideas, wars, goodness knows what. And I'd like people like Schuckman and everybody that he reports for to be right at the front of defining that agenda.
OK, well, let's all get on out there and change agendas, whether it's using tunnels under motorways, whether it's sex, death, and this is getting dodgy, isn't it? And animals, or whether it's using our creativity in communities to build better futures. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good journey home.
Yeah, you've been a wonderful conference. Well done.